For this project, I'd like to talk about Benjamin Britten and one of my favorite choral pieces of all time, a hymn to Saint Cecilia. Benjamin Britten was born in 1913 and died in 1967, putting him right in the middle of the early 20th century composers. He was an English composer, he was a conductor, and a pianist. He did all of his studies at the Royal College of London, and some of his famous works are Peter Grimes, which he written in 1945, his War Requiem, which is 1962, and The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra in 1945. Britten's choral works are as follows. He wrote 12 vocal or choral orchestral works, including the War Requiem and the Sea Symphony, 17 vocal works, including the Songs and Proverbs of William Blake. He wrote 8 choral works, including A Ceremony of Carols and Rejoice in the Lamb, 14 operas, including Billy Budd, 3 church parables, and 1 ballet, called The Prince of the Pagodas. The piece I'd like to introduce you all today is called A Hymn to Saint Cecilia. Its original title was 3 Songs for Saint Cecilia's Day. There are 3 reasons why Britten probably wrote this piece. 1, he was also born on Saint Cecilia's Day. Saint Cecilia is the patron saint of music, and it is English tradition to write to Saint Cecilia, an honor and ode. Other composers include John Gardner, Herbert Howells, and James Macmillan, just to name a few. The piece was written on board the MS Axel Johnson, a boat en route to England from the United States with his partner, Peter Pierce. It was finished on April 2nd, 1942. Also composed on the same journey was A Ceremony of Carols. Before Britten got on the boat, American customs took most of his manuscripts away from him, including most of the first movement of Hymn to Saint Cecilia. Because they thought it contained codes relating to World War II, because it was nearing the end of the war. So lost was his first movement, and he had to rewrite the whole entire thing on his boat ride back. During this piece, and you'll see in our second module today, the entire work gives reference to waves on a boat. The poet for A Hymn to Saint Cecilia is W.H. Auden. Auden was born in 1907 and died in 1973. He was an English poet, critic, playwright, and librettist. He was a major influence in 20th century poetry. He was the winner of the 1948 Pulitzer Prize for The Age of Anxiety. His poems mostly consist of moral issues with very strong political, social, and psychological content. He was sometimes referred to as an anti-romantic, which kind of makes sense as an early 20th century composer, but just to the extreme as this composer was. And you'll find out later in the poem of Hymn to Saint Cecilia. Auden had a significant influence on Britten, encouraging him to widen his aesthetic, intellectual, and political horizons, and to come to terms with his homosexuality. Auden and Britten traveled to America together, however did not return together. Auden, while in the United States, wrote Britten a letter giving him some tips on composition, how to be a better writer, and Britten didn't like that very much, and pretty much wrote Auden off after that. They were friends for a very long time, and that one simple letter really just kind of ruined the relationship between Britten and Auden. I think it's important that you get to read the poem before we start talking about the work in the second module. So take a few seconds and you can read the poem. It'll go by fairly quickly. Some ideas about the poem in the first section here. Saint Cecilia was a Roman martyr. Her association with music is based on the legend that on her wedding night, she refused to give up her virginity to her husband and sat apart from the wedding feast, singing in her heart to God. This kind of gave her, as the the parable went and all of these things happened, that she was going to be the sacred saint of music. We have a picture of Saint Cecilia sitting in her garden by the sea. The pure virgin martyr whose music enchants the goddess of love, Aphrodite, brings angels down to earth and eases the pain of sinners in hell. The final section is the actual ode to Saint Cecilia herself, asking her to appear and inspire, and to startle composing mortals with immortal fire. The same text is repeated at the end of each section. Take a few seconds and read the second section of the poem. Some poetic ideas of the section 2 is the idea that the speaker is kind of an annoying child that does not want to grow up. Many have said, and this is something that I have written, that I've read during my research, was that Auden wrote this about Brittain. Kind of thinking that, he was in the closet and he was afraid to kind of be who he was, and was kind of whiny and all of those kinds of things. The divided soprano and tenor chase through each other in a teasing dance, and the altos and basses are the boring and responsible adults that hold everything together. And keep that in mind as we study the work in the next module. In a letter sent to Brittain from Auden, he says that you are always tempted to make things too easy for yourself, to build yourself a warm nest of love by playing the lovable, talented little boy. Pretty interesting. The final lines before the ode, I shall never be different, love me, illustrate to me the innocence of the voice in the poem. And we, the listeners, are truly able to feel what the speaker is not, whether it be emotional pain or simply not being able to feel worldly things just because of the innocence. Take a few seconds and read the third section of the poem. The poetic ideas of the third section is that there are significant parallels between the poem and Brittain's life in the third section. The speaker, presumably a boy, returns sadder, full of regret, and seems lost. Each of the soloists mimic an instrument, violin, flute, and trumpet, and the first two link music to pain of Dreadful Things You Did is the actual text. The tenor soloist, sounding like a trumpet, telling to claim suffering as a badge of honor, oh, where your tribulation like a rose. I feel that Auden was again pushing Brittain to be more than who he was or who he wanted to be, both in music and in his personal life and political. This section is the actual ode to Saint Cecilia, which you hear a couple of times in the poem. Blessed Cecilia, appear in visions to all musicians, appear and inspire. Translated daughter, come down and startle composing mortals with immortal fire. Beautifully, beautifully illustrates a musician's prayer and need for help.